Data. It's everywhere, right?
Hmm.
We hear it called the new oil, the lifeblood of the digital age, powering everything from, like, personalized ads to global supply chains. But just like oil, how it moves across borders, well, that's a whole other story, and it's not always a smooth journey.
No, not at all. Think about it. Scientists in different countries working together on, some groundbreaking research or a company trying to improve its services using feedback from customers all over the world. It all depends on data flowing freely and securely across borders.
And that's where things get complicated. The sources you sent for this deep dive really highlight the challenges, and they're pretty hefty of regulating something as essential yet intangible as data. We're going deep into how three major players on the global stage, the European Union, the United States, and China, are tackling the issue of cross-border data transfer.
Exactly. And it's not just about listing out rules and regulations. We're looking at the bigger picture here. Why do these different approaches exist? What are the underlying values and priorities driving them? And what do they mean for companies trying to navigate the complexities of global business?
The materials you provided highlight a really interesting tension. It's like a balancing act between the immense potential of global data transfer. Think about things like economic growth and rapid innovation, and the equally important considerations of data privacy, security, and even national security. It's a tricky tightrope to walk.
It really is. And to help us unpack these different approaches, your sources introduce a really useful framework, the idea of institutional logics. This basically means that each of these players, the EU, the US, and China, they each have their own set of core values, core beliefs, and those shape how they approach regulating something as fundamental as cross-border data transfer.
So it's not just about the technicalities of data, but about different worldviews colliding in the digital space, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about how these different worldviews translate into concrete laws and regulations that have real implications for businesses and individuals alike.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's start with the European Union.
Yeah.
What do you say is their primary driving force, their main concern when it comes to data?
Well, for the EU, it's pretty clear. The dominant institutional logic is, without a doubt, privacy protection. I mean, they really champion the idea that privacy is a fundamental human right, not just some legal technicality. This is deeply embedded in their laws and in their culture, shaped in part by their history.
And that strong emphasis on privacy is most clearly reflected in their, I'd say, landmark piece of legislation, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Tell us a bit more about that.
Right, the GDPR, it's kind of a big deal. Came into effect in 2018, and it's incredibly comprehensive. It sets really strict rules for how companies can collect, use, and share personal data. And the sources you provided emphasize that it's been really influential globally, even acting as a model for data protection laws in other countries.
So it's not just about the EU, it's having ripple effects all over. But getting back to the specifics, how does this emphasis on privacy translate into actual rules about data leaving the EU's borders?
So the GDPR makes transferring personal data outside the EU pretty tough. The basic idea is you can't do it unless the country receiving that data has what the EU considers an adequate level of data protection.
Adequate. That sounds like a high bar to clear. How many countries have actually met the EU's standards and received that adequate designation?
Not many, actually. It's a pretty exclusive club. The EU takes a lot of factors into account, like the rule of law, respect for human rights, whether there are independent data protection authorities, and international commitments. Right now, only about 15 countries and territories have made the cut.
So it's a small club with strict entry requirements. But what happens if a company needs to transfer data to a country that's not on that list? Are they just stuck?
No, not necessarily. The GDPR does offer some alternative routes. There are things like binding corporate rules, BCRs. Those are like internal company rules for data protection within a group of companies. And then there are the very commonly used standard contractual clauses, SCCs. These are basically pre-approved contract terms designed to safeguard data when it's transferred. Plus, there are approved codes of conduct, certification mechanisms, things like that.
Okay, so there are options, but it definitely sounds like it adds another layer of, well, red tape for companies. More paperwork, more hoops to jump through.
Yeah, you could say that. And even with those safeguards, the company exporting the data still has the ultimate responsibility to make sure the data is properly protected in the recipient country. And then there are certain very specific exceptions, like if someone explicitly agrees to the transfer or if it's absolutely necessary for a specific reason. That's covered in Article 49 of the GDPR.
And the sources also point out a specific example that really drives home how seriously the EU takes these rules. That massive fine slapped on Meta, right?
Right, that 1.2 billion euro fine in 2023, that was a wake-up call for a lot of companies. Meta was found to be transferring data in a way that didn't comply with the GDPR. It really shows that the EU means business, and the cost of non-compliance can be, well,
Yeah,
huge.
€1 billion is definitely not pocket change. And then there's this interesting concept that the sources bring up, the Brussels effect. Can you explain what that is and how it connects to the EU's data regulations?
Sure, the Brussels effect basically means that the EU's rules and regulations can end up impacting businesses globally, even outside the EU. It's because the EU is such a large market that many companies find it easier to just adopt the EU standards, like the GDPR, across all their operations, rather than having different systems for different regions. It's almost like the EU is setting the global standard by default.
Right, it's like, why create a separate system for each country when you can just follow the strictest one and be covered everywhere?
Hmm.
It makes business sense, I guess, even if it can be quite demanding.
Exactly. So, in a way, the EU's emphasis on privacy is having an impact far beyond its own borders, pushing other countries to consider similar levels of protection.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got a good understanding of the EU's approach. Now let's hop across the Atlantic and look at the United States. What would you say is the main philosophy, the guiding principle behind their approach to cross-border data transfer?
Well, it's pretty different from the EU. In the US, the main logic at play is what we can call a market liberalization logic. The focus is on promoting free markets, economic growth, competition, and they really believe that less regulation, especially when it comes to data, is the best way to achieve that.
So while the EU is all about privacy first, the US is more about keeping things open and letting the market drive innovation.
Yeah, you could put it that way. And that philosophy is reflected in their legal framework, which, unlike the EU with the GDPR, is a bit more, let's say, piecemeal.
Piecemeal, meaning they don't have a single all-encompassing law for data protection like the GDPR.
Exactly. Instead, they have a bunch of different federal and state laws that cover specific industries or types of sensitive data. For example, in healthcare, you have IPA, which protects health information. Then there's GLBA for financial information, COPAPA for children's data online, and so on. It's like a patchwork quilt of regulations.
So it's more targeted, focus on specific areas of concern. And how about when it comes to data leaving the U.S.? Are there many restrictions on that?
Generally speaking, no. The U.S. has very few restrictions on cross-border data transfer and hardly any data localization requirements, except for a few very sensitive categories of data. They really want to keep data flowing freely both in and out of the country.
And what about state-level laws? California's CCPA and CPRA, for instance, were seen as big steps forward for privacy in the U.S. Do those impact data transfers across borders?
You're right. The California Consumer Privacy Act and then its amendment, the California Privacy Rights Act, were pretty groundbreaking. They give consumers more control over their data. But when it comes to specifically restricting cross-border transfers, they don't do much of that. The focus is more on consumer rights within a market context, not so much on, say, strict user consent as the main legal basis for processing data, which is a big difference from the GDPR.
I see. So it's still very much about balancing those consumer rights with the needs of a free-flowing market. And the sources also mentioned that the U.S. actually goes a step further and actively promotes this unrestricted data flow through international agreements.
Absolutely. They've really pushed for it in trade deals like the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Even though the US pulled out of the TPP, that commitment to free data flow was kept in the revised version, the CPT-TPP, and also in the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
So it's a consistent theme in their international dealings. And it's
Mhm.
not just about letting data flow out. The U.S. also wants access to data held in other countries, right?
Yeah, definitely. The Cloud Act is a good example of that. It basically allows U.S. law enforcement to demand data from U.S.-based companies, even if that data is stored in a different country. That's caused some controversy, obviously, with some countries seeing it as an overreach of U.S. authority. And then you have things like the Patriot Act and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which also give the U.S. government pretty broad powers to access global data for, well, intelligence purposes.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. They want to keep data flowing freely out, but they also want the ability to access data held elsewhere when they need to.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. And the underlying belief seems to be that this open approach ultimately benefits everyone by encouraging innovation and economic growth.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty clear picture of the U.S. approach. Now let's shift gears and head over to China. What would you say are the defining features of their approach to cross-border data transfer?
China's a bit different from both the EU and the US. Their approach is very much driven by what the sources call a national security and development logic. They want to benefit from the global data economy, but they're also extremely concerned about national security and making sure their own tech sector thrives. It's about finding a balance between those two priorities.
And they've really ramped up their legal framework in this area recently, haven't they?
Yeah, in the past few years, they've introduced some pretty significant laws. The cybersecurity law in 2016, the data security law, and the personal information protection law, both in 2021. These three laws form the core of their data governance system.
And that theme of national security that you mentioned, it runs through all of them, doesn't it? How does that translate into specific rules about data leaving China?
Well, the cybersecurity law focuses on protecting what they call critical information infrastructure and requires companies in key sectors to store personal data and what they term important data within China. The data security law builds on that by creating a system for classifying data based on how important it is for national security. And the Personal Information Protection Law, or PIPL, has really strict rules on transferring personal data out of China, specifically prohibiting anything that could risk national security or public interest.
So there are a lot of safeguards in place. It's definitely not as open as the U.S. approach.
No, not at all. The PIPL basically lays out very specific, limited ways to transfer data across borders. You have to go through a security assessment done by the government, get certain certifications, or use standard contractual clauses. And then there's data localization, which is a big one. Companies operating critical infrastructure or processing lots of personal data, they generally have to keep that data in China. And if they want to transfer it out, they need to go through that security assessment process we talked about.
Those assessments, I imagine they're not just a quick rubber stamp. They sound pretty thorough.
They're meant to be. They involve a very detailed evaluation of any potential risks to national security if that data leaves China. It definitely makes it harder to get data out. And the PIPL also aims to protect against foreign governments getting access to data that could be a threat to China's national security. You need explicit government approval to hand over data to foreign courts or law enforcement.
Hmm.
And China can actually stop data transfers altogether if they believe it's a risk to their national security.
It sounds like they're really serious about this. And the
Yeah.
sources mentioned that big fine against Didi, the ride-hailing company, as a clear example of that.
Right? Didi was fined 8.026 billion RMB for how they handled data, and it was specifically because they were found to have jeopardized national security. That sent a very strong message to other companies.
Yeah, you don't mess around with data security in China, that's for sure. But despite all these controls, China still wants to be a part of the global digital economy, right? They're not completely isolating themselves.
No, they're not. They know that data transfer is crucial for their economic growth, but they want to do it on their own terms, in a way that aligns with their national security priorities. They're part of regional trade agreements like RCEP and have expressed interest in joining others like CPTPP and DIPA, though those data localization requirements are a sticking point. They're trying to find that balance between security and openness.
So we've got the EU prioritizing privacy, the U.S. championing open markets, and China focusing on national security and development. But the sources you shared also talk about how these approaches aren't static, they're evolving over time. What are the main things driving these changes, would you say?
There are several factors at play. One is technological and economic development. The EU, they've had some struggles with digital competitiveness, so they've been more cautious, more focused on protection. The US, being a digital powerhouse, has pushed for more open data flows. And China, they're growing rapidly in the digital space, but they still rely on other countries for some key technologies, so security is paramount for them. But as these landscapes shift, so do the regulatory priorities.
It's like a constantly moving target.
Yeah.
Can you give us some specific examples of how these changes are happening in each region? Let's start with the EU.
Sure. The EU is realizing that being super strict on privacy can have downsides. It can hinder digital trade and make them less competitive globally. So they're looking for ways to be a bit more flexible while still protecting privacy. The new EU-US data privacy framework, which was just approved in July 2023, is a great example of that. It's a new attempt to create a safe way to transfer data between the EU and the US, replacing those older agreements, Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield. That didn't quite work out.
It's like they're trying to build a bridge across the Atlantic for data to flow more smoothly. What about the U.S.? How are they adapting?
The U.S. is facing some pressure, both domestically and internationally. There's more talk about needing stronger privacy protections for Americans, and there's growing concern about competition with China, especially in tech. So you're seeing them shift a bit, putting more emphasis on national security and individual privacy while still trying to keep the benefits of open data flows. The Draft American Data Privacy and Protection Act, ADPPA, is a good example. It would create a more comprehensive federal privacy law in the US, and it includes provisions about data access by, China, Russia, those sorts of things. It shows they're thinking more about national security now. And then there's the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, aimed at apps like TikTok, which again highlights these national security concerns. It seems like the US government might be taking a more active role in cybersecurity and tech regulation.
So, bit of a course correction for them. And what about China? Are they easing up on those strict controls at all?
There are signs that they're recognizing that maybe they went a little too far, that being too strict can actually hurt businesses and make them less competitive. They've introduced some new initiatives like the Opinions on Establishing a Better Data Basic System and are working on provisions on regulating and promoting cross-border data flow, trying to simplify things, especially for smaller businesses, and potentially relax some of those data localization rules. They're also involved in global data governance discussions and experimenting with different approaches in their free trade zones.
So it sounds like everyone's trying to find that sweet spot, that balance between letting data flow and protecting security and privacy. But the sources also make it clear that there are still some big obstacles in the way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are still major conflicts, mostly because these core values, these institutional logics we talked about, they're just fundamentally different. The EU and the US, they've been going back and forth for years, trying to find a system for data transfers that works for both of them, and it's been a bumpy road. The EU's focus on privacy often clashes with how the US prioritizes market growth and its government surveillance practices. It creates a lot of uncertainty and extra costs for companies like Meta.
And the relationship between the EU and China on data issues seems even more complicated.
It is. There aren't many agreements in place between them for data transfers, nothing comparable to what the EU has with other regions. They mostly rely on those standard contractual clauses, which can be a real headache, especially for Chinese companies trying to do business in the EU. Plus, the EU is worried about being able to access data held in China because of their data localization rules and what they consider important data, which can be a pretty broad definition.
And then you have the US and China. And that relationship is, well, let's just say it's complicated for a whole bunch of reasons, not just data.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. You have the US saying their laws apply to US companies even when their data is stored abroad, while China wants to keep data within its borders. It's a clash of priorities and legal systems. And then there's the whole geopolitical situation, the US-China rivalry, which adds another layer of complexity and risk for companies operating in both countries. You've got the US scrutinizing and even banning apps like TikTok over national security concerns, and new US laws specifically targeting data flows with China. It's messy, to say the least.
So for multinational companies trying to operate globally, trying to navigate all of this, it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be. They need expert legal teams who can keep up with all these ever-changing rules in different countries. They have to constantly weigh the costs of complying with all these regulations against the potential benefits of doing business in a particular market. And sometimes it might just be too much, and they have to decide to avoid certain markets altogether. It's forcing them to get creative with solutions like data localization, where they store data within a specific country to comply with local laws, and data residency, where they keep data in a specific region. And this, of course, leads to more fragmented operations, more complexity. It can also impact where companies choose to locate their physical offices and data centers. It's reshaping the global business landscape.
It really is. And the sources you shared suggest that all of this is ripe for further research. What are some of the key questions that researchers are looking at going forward?
There are a lot of unanswered questions. For one, we need to better understand how these differences in data rules create a new kind of distance between countries, a digital distance, if you will, and how that impacts companies operating internationally, their costs, their efficiency, and even their ability to compete. The link between data regulations, political risks, and the trend towards deglobalization also needs more exploration. Researchers are starting to integrate these data governance issues into existing international business theories and looking at the real-world impact on multinational companies, especially those in the digital sphere.
And how about the companies themselves? How are they adapting to these challenges?
That's another big area for research. How do these different national approaches to data influence a company's strategy, their product development, their decisions about which markets to enter? We might even be seeing a new phenomenon where different parts of the same company have to operate under different data governance rules, a sort of institutional pluralism within multinational organizations. And how do companies change their internal structures and processes to deal with these shifting regulations? There are also questions about how data restrictions affect the role of subsidiaries within multinational companies, especially when those subsidiaries are located in places with stricter data rules. Could this shift the balance of power within companies, giving more autonomy to subsidiaries? And what does it mean for innovation when data is more tightly controlled? Finally, researchers are looking at how these data issues influence a company's choice of entry mode, whether it's exporting, setting up joint ventures, or building their own subsidiaries, and how it affects their overall internationalization strategy, especially for those fast growing digital startups that operate globally from day one. The role of data ecosystems in helping companies navigate these complex regulations is also an emerging area of research.
It sounds like there's a lot to unpack, a lot more to learn, and there's also a clear need for more research on the bigger policy implications, especially given the potential for more international cooperation.
Absolutely. No single company and no single country can solve these challenges alone. We need more coordinated action at the global level. But that raises a whole host of questions. What's the best way to work together? Should it be through bilateral agreements between two countries or multilateral agreements involving many countries? Do we need new international organizations specifically focused on data governance, maybe at a regional level or even a global one? And how do we fit all of this into the existing framework of the World Trade Organization? Or do we need a completely new system? Most importantly, how do we create a global system for governing data that balances all these competing interests? Security, privacy, and the need for data to flow freely to support economic growth. How do we make sure all countries, especially developing countries, have a voice in this process and that the system is fair and equitable? It's a huge challenge, but some experts put it the goal is to create a human data community of shared destiny, a future where data benefits everyone.
That's a powerful vision. So to wrap things up, what would you say is the main takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the key message is that managing cross border data transfers is a balancing act. It's about finding ways to enable innovation and global trade while protecting individual rights and ensuring national security. As we've seen, different countries have very different ideas about how to do that, and these approaches are constantly changing.
It's a dynamic landscape full of challenges, but also opportunities.
Exactly. Companies need to be flexible, stay informed, and be really strategic about how they approach data in this globalized world.
So for our listeners, here's something to think about. Data is becoming more and more important in our lives. How do you think these global tensions around data will play out? What will the long-term consequences be for individuals and for businesses? What other questions come to mind after hearing about these complex issues? It's a conversation that needs to continue.